Great. I want to add my voice to those of a lot of our colleagues here in thanking you for including me. And also, it's good to see many of you who I met for the first time in London 2 years ago. So with that, thank you. When we were meeting as a panel prior to coming here, we agreed on who would talk about different aspects of this. And so I am going to talk specifically about the radiologic risks related to terrorism, although there's a much broader when we look at weapons of both mass destruction as well as mass disruption. For those of you who don't know NTI, let me just give you a real brief overview of who we are. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization based in Washington, but we have a very big mission. We are very much focused on reducing risks from catastrophic threats. And in that, and Francois had wanted me to mention that we work across the spectrum in chemical, nuclear, radiologic, biologic, as well as increasingly in cyber. And for those of you who want to have questions about that, I'm happy to address that over the coffee break. We do, however, and it is a growing program for us, have a very robust program on radiologic, and that area has direct implications for insurance as well as reinsurance and ways in which this threat can be mitigated. As a general rule, certainly this area is the purview of governments, but in our experience, governments alone cannot do this, and we must have the active participation and cooperation of private industry, private sector, the business community, as well as nonprofits to bring some fresh thinking to the table. With respect to the radiologic threat, this one is different than the nuclear. The nuclear tends to have the materials concentrated in a relatively small number of countries, and it's fairly well secure. Whereas, and it would also be very difficult from a technical perspective for terrorist or extremist groups to acquire and build, then transport and detonate, not impossible, but a nuclear area. And governments do, of course, need to continue to focus and work on that. But the situation and the landscape is very different when it comes to the radiologic. These materials are widely available in ubiquitous use throughout industry for a wide variety of very good reasons, but they largely tend to be in areas of soft targets that are underprotected and ill understood in terms of the risks that they have. When we think about radiologic terrorism, what we're talking about here is the spewing of radiologic material that would cost billions of dollars in damage due to the costs associated with evacuation, relocation, demolition, and cleanup. Many of these areas are the vulnerabilities of this, and there's been a lot of discussion about it, but not all radioisotopes are the same. And as Steve can go into far greater detail, the one that is of greatest concern is what we call cesium-137, and that has to do with its compensation. It is a powder. And were it to be put together with explosives, the powder would be widely spewed and would be very difficult from a cleanup perspective, to the point where in reality you would have to do demolition of the buildings, and major city blocks would be uninhabitable for a broad area of time. We think from our perspective that this threat is on the rise. There are radical terrorist organizations that have said that they are actively looking to acquire and use this radioactive material in dirty bombs, and that evidence is growing. We can talk certainly with our Belgian colleagues here who can tell us that in 2016, Belgian investigators discovered terrorists monitoring an employee at a highly enriched uranium reactor that also produces most of the medical isotopes that we're talking about here today that are broadly in use throughout Europe. In 2011, the manifesto of terrorists in Norway who killed over 77 people with conventional weapons included page after page details in his manifesto on how to procure radiologic sources to build and detonate radiologic bombs. The manifesto also encouraged that these materials were readily available on the black market. And in 2003, coalition forces in Afghanistan recovered plans for a dirty bomb, and a year earlier, an American who had attended an Al-Qaeda training camp in Pakistan was arrested for plotting to build a radiologic weapon. These are just a few examples, but I think hopefully it's making the message clear that this is something that is a clear and present danger or threat. And let's spend a minute to talk about why terrorists would want to set off a dirty bomb, besides the fact that relative to other CBRN areas, it's going to be relatively easy to do. Unlike a nuclear weapon, a dirty bomb would not cause catastrophic levels of death and injury. But depending on the chemistry, the form, and the location, what it would do would be to terrify citizens in the area in which it was detonated and indeed around the world. It would also exacerbate the growing public mistrust of government's ability now to protect against devastating attacks. It would also generate, and I think our earlier speakers spoke about this, a tremendous amount of media attention for the terrorist organizations behind it, which would help with recruiting and financial support. And it would also likely have massive economic repercussions, estimated in the tens of billions of dollars, as thousands of people and businesses would be relocated, buildings demolished, and debris removed. And to be very clear, it would impact large sections of a city that would be rendered, as I mentioned earlier, uninhabitable for years. This is why dirty bombs are often referred to as weapons of mass disruption. Now, on this, there is good news in this situation. And the more we can raise awareness around these threats and where they are located, the more likely we are to be able to convince the end users to substitute these technologies that use cesium-137 for alternative technologies that are out there and readily available. And we have a big program that we have underway working with hospitals, not only in New York City, Atlanta, the state of California, but also more recently in London, to talk through with hospitals the advantage of substituting out the kinds of cesium that are being used in blood irradiators and research radiators with alternative technology as positive and concrete steps that can be taken to reduce this risk, other than just saying it's ubiquitous throughout industry. So with that, why don't I stop and be ready to take any kind of questions that you may have.